Good morning, everybody. It's Jeff Goldberg for the Sales Pro Network. It is Friday, May 30th, and we are starting our second broadcast this morning. If you joined us at 10 a.m. Eastern, you noticed that we had some technical problems. I've never had that happen with StreamYard before, but I had to reboot my computer, start a new stream, and start over. So none of you may be watching this live, but you can watch this on the replay. If you have joined us before, then you know that I'm a sales coach and trainer, and I work with both individuals and organizations to help them get measurable and sustainable sales increases. And every Friday at 10 a.m. Eastern, I either do a live training or a live interview with somebody who can add value to the profession of sales. And today is no exception. Let's, for the second time, welcome today's guest, Michael Adams, who's a certified sales leader and an outsourced VP of sales. Good morning again, Mike.
Good morning, Jeff. How are you?
I'll be better if we actually make it through this one. I'm not sure what happened on that last attempt. It's never happened before, but let's see if we can get this going. So I think when we lost our broadcast, you were in the middle of explaining your background. So would you please give us the 2 to 3 minute version of your background, and then we'll get to all the sales questions that I have.
Absolutely. I'll just start at the beginning and go more Reader's Digest version. As I was saying, my career started, it was more like a consumer products type of companies that I was working for. And I was selling products into, retail locations, whether it was convenience stores, retail stores, drug stores, grocery stores, etc. And, it was great training ground. Because it was a high frequency of calls on a daily basis. And so you learn very quickly, you had to be prepared, you had to have kind of your process, and you had to know how to focus and capture people's attention, because you might only get them for a minute. And if you miss out, you have to move on. Then I kind of graduated to managing what they would call key accounts or national accounts or bigger customers. And it was a completely different animal. Not only did you have to be prepared, but you had to be, ready to kind of solve problems. And also one of the key learnings I had is you also had to be ready to say no. A lot of times when you get into those types of settings, I learned very quickly, one, you can't tell everybody what they want to hear. And secondarily, I was only going to tell the truth because I just wasn't good at remembering the alternative. And so I had a lot of key learnings in going through that process that, sometimes you have to walk away, and sometimes you're going to be tested, and there's things that are going to happen. I think that kind of led me down the path of wanting to better understand what went into, the products, the merchandising, the marketing, everything. And so I got very involved in things like sales training, customer marketing, trade marketing, regular marketing. And I think that helped to kind of carry me into, my executive leadership type of career that I had. What I became as I went into those roles is I had kind of evolved to someone who was a problem solver. I was kind of attracted to where there was a company, a business, or something that we couldn't solve, or there was just a problem that needed to be overcome. And I kind of embraced that and led teams down that path. So the good thing about that is it allowed me to be creative and do things. The bad thing is a lot of times when you solve problems in those roles, you're working yourself out of a job. And so many times it led to a lot of different opportunities and things within companies. And a lot of times it just gave me a great deal of exposure. As that was going on, and as I was in between things, or as my career evolved, I had a lot of times that I did what, people asking me questions, people looking for help. I solved a lot of problems and did a bunch of different independent kind of consulting gigs at the time. And then I decided about 2 years ago that this was the path that I was going to take, and that I was going to focus on it. And I really enjoy it. I think it's exciting. I like doing different things, and I like helping people to solve problems.
Love that. So, Mike, you say that when you're talking with business owners or salespeople, that they often think that the sale starts when you're in the meeting, making the word I hate, making the pitch.
Yep.
But the truth is, sales success starts much earlier. What do you mean by that?
Yeah, I think we all kind of go through this process, and people who are not exposed to, what a true sales process looks like, their experience with sales is, and I hate to use the example, but it's the used car salesman. It's like someone trying to jump into a sales pitch before they know anything or before they have the information. And, the biggest piece of advice that I gave salespeople, account managers, people that I've trained, people that I've worked with over the years is that the less that you can make your presentation about a presentation, the more successful you're going to be. And I'll give you an example of that. When it becomes like, big money, big stakes. I had a team, and I was at Newell Brands, and we were selling programs into Costco, for example. And a Costco 16-week program could be worth $50 million. And when you go to Costco to quote unquote present your program, you better have everything done. There is no presentation. You know what they need, you know what you're going to deliver, you know all the questions they're going to ask. It's really about trying to turn that discussion into a partnership as to how you can make that program as successful, even more successful than anticipated. And so I guess what I generally mean by that is that the less that you have to go into, I'll use your word, the sales pitch, the better off you are. The more work you've done, the more you've gained credibility, and the more you've solved problems for people, the less you're going to have to kind of sell your goods.
Hmm. Okay. So, you know, most of what you're doing today is you're acting as a fractional vice president of sales, an outsourced vice president of sales. And
Yep.
you work through a famous organization called Sales Acceleration, which is all across the country, maybe all across the world. And according to their 2025 report, 92% of businesses, 92% don't
Yep.
understand their own sales process or what needs to happen at each stage of the sale. Why is this? Why do companies, what do companies like this need to do?
Yeah, well, I think it's because if you think about number of companies, a huge percentage of total companies that are out there fall into the small and medium business scope of businesses. And if you think about the life cycle of small businesses when people start them, it's usually a founder or a CEO or someone who has a great idea and they've identified a need and they're going to bring a business, into the marketplace. And one of their key priorities when they start generally isn't sales. They aren't going out and hiring a sales professional. They're not going out and putting sales processes into place because, they're usually going out and talking about their business and creating excitement and doing all the things that need to happen early on. What ends up happening is once you hit that ceiling of where the company is going to, it's as big as it's going to get organically, and you now have to, create a scalable business model. I think that's what we're talking about. I think most folks don't realize that, there's more to selling than just going out and kind of making people aware of your product, and building that process is critical to it. Plus I think with most of those people, not having a sales background, they don't really understand the benefit. And so, I think that's why we see so many people who kind of hit that ceiling and they really can't bring it to the next level, is because, they're working hard, they're doing a lot of things, but it's really just not delivering the way that it did early on.
So, what is it that they actually need to do? I mean, if they don't understand their own sales cycle or their sales process, what is it that they actually need to do besides hire a guy like you or me?
Yeah, well, I think a lot of times it comes down to, how are they approaching sales, who's running it, and what is the overall approach? Because a lot of times in those situations, you find that there's maybe one person that's doing the vast majority of the sales. So I think they need to evaluate, what it is that they want to do going forward. I think they need to figure out what got them where they are now, and I think they need to start to put, some repetition into the process. It's much like what I talked about with that example of early on in my career. I think those of us who've been in sales for a long time understand that activity drives sales. good targeted activity drives more sales and more success. And so if you start to look at what you've been doing and how you've been doing it, and you ramp that up and do it in a way so that you can kind of measure what's working and what's not working, hopefully it gets you in front of more of the right people with the right message, and it gives you a higher success rate at closing business.
I've worked with a lot of major companies like Citibank and Aramark and Cisco and Siemens,
Yep.
as well as small companies like you do, small to medium businesses, which is mostly where I focus today. And I think everybody has a sales process. They just aren't aware of it. They're doing something when they're out
Yep.
there selling, but they're not aware of it. Whereas the professional sales organization or the professional salesperson, they understand each step of the process that they're doing, and they know when it's supposed to take place and what to do. I mean, I happen to teach a 6-step process. I know there are 10-step process and 7.
Yep.
I don't know that there's any right number of steps, but I find that knowing what the particular steps of your particular sales process are makes you way more likely to be successful than just winging it or doing whatever what you think is not a sales process. Look, if you're selling, you're doing something, whether you're just going in and pitching or you're asking, whatever it is, you're doing something. But being aware of it, being conscious, being mindful of it allows you to have more control over it and to start recognizing what parts are working, what parts are not working, what do you have to change, does something you have to move around. So I think the answer to the question I asked you, which is, so what do companies like this need to do? They actually do need to hire somebody like you, unless they have somebody on staff who actually can analyze, what are you doing now? And here's how we can make it more organized in order to do it better. And okay, somebody's found us today. Thank you, Mimi. Mimi says she agrees that everyone has a process, and knowing your system is wisdom. So Mike, we are live somewhere, and somebody's
That's
watching.
awesome.
Thank you, Mimi.
Welcome, Mimi. I agree. I think, Jeff, the point you're making is spot on. I mean, I think the thing that I always try to tell people is, assume something happens tomorrow. Your number one salesperson leaves, the person can't sell anymore. Do you have documentation? Do you have something so that someone can step in and act, look, sound just like what you want them to go forward? And I think that's how you can detect if there's something in place or not.
Gotcha. Now, so many salespeople struggle to succeed because they simply aren't seeing enough qualified prospects. And I say this all the time. I don't care how good you are at selling. You could be as good as you are, as good as I am, could be as good as the two of us are together. And I'm sure that's a pretty good salesperson. But without seeing enough prospects, I can't close enough business. I don't close everybody I meet. I'd love to say that I do. And people tell me that all the time, but they're never able to prove it. Nobody closes everybody. Even guys with experience like yourself and mine, we can't close enough business unless we're seeing enough prospects. So what are some of the techniques or the methodologies that you're teaching or sharing with salespeople today to fill their pipeline with appointments, their calendar with appointments, and of course their pipeline with deals? Because to me, that's where it all starts. If you don't have enough prospects, you're screwed.
No, and I think the other point that I would make about that is it's kind of the roll up your sleeves and get your hands dirty part that people don't like, and so people are always looking for kind of the quick fix to get leads, right? And we hear all sorts of great things now. We hear about how AI can generate leads and how you can outsource and how you can do all those things, and I don't want to minimize those, but I think what I always try to tell people is it's a multi-tiered approach is the way that I like to look at it. One of the things we always preached in consumer products, it was all about your existing and your expired customers, right? It's about the people you're doing business with or you've already done business with. It's much easier to plug and play with someone who's already worked with you than to start from scratch. So making sure you have a strategy that starts with, am I working with my existing customers to extend, grow, do bigger and better things? Am I going back to customers who maybe work with me and something happened, and seeing if they have needs? And the other one that I always challenge people with too is going back to those people that the pitch didn't work out, right? I've had multiple times in my career where someone didn't want to work with me or something happened, and I go back and talk to them a year later and say, how'd it work out? How'd it go? And they didn't get what they wanted. So making sure that you start with kind of the world that you already know and that you're working in, and do everything within your power to maximize and expand that, even to the point of talking to those people and saying, is there someone within your network, is there someone that you're talking to on a regular basis who I should be talking to? Use them to help you to build up your, to build up your prospects, and to, continue to do the things, whether it's AI based or whether it's straight outreach, but using your network and using the people around you to get warmer contacts and warmer prospects is always going to give you a higher likelihood of success. And I'll explain what I mean about that, because I know that could just sound like a lot of words sometime. But I was working with a service company recently, and they didn't have a very specific channel strategy. They were kind of doing a lot of different things, and we drilled into figuring out what their strength was, and we identified a channel that we think was the best way for them to go after the business. So instead of just starting with kind of cold outreach, what we did is we said, let's look into your network. Let's look at businesses you've worked with. Let's look at adjacencies around this, and let's start from that before we go out and reach out. And they were very skeptical at the concept. And so we even used kind of a LinkedIn outreach and worked with the two people that were doing sales and identified people in their network that were kind of in that ideal customer profile, and then people who were adjacent. And we said, let's do a test. And we picked two people that were basically the customers we wanted to work with, and three people that we thought could get us there. And we did a test. And I'm not going to say this is my usual hit rate, but we went 5 for 5 by going out, informing people about how you can help them within their space, and then reaching out to other people and saying, I know you work with people like this. Are there some people that you think we can help today? And, it was a very good, and it was a good reinforcement that the concept of, it doesn't all have to be starting from zero. Sometimes, sometimes there's people right around the corner that you can help and need your help.
Yeah, I always say there's gold in your database, but what if you don't have one? What if a new salesperson is just starting out, or somebody just joins a new company? They don't have any existing customers to go back to. Look, I'm with you. There's nothing better than a referral.
Yep.
I'll take referrals all day long over everything else. But what if you don't have that ability or the possibility to do that, because that's just not the stage of your career you're at? What other methods are you suggesting these days for outreach?
Well, I think that, there's plenty of ways, and I'll use LinkedIn as an example. There's plenty of ways to build a network that's targeted at getting to the people that you think are going to help you to advance your business. And it's not always directly to them. So, I think we'd all like to think the best thing we could do is reach out to 100 different CEOs, and that it's going to magically, help us to build our business. And, a lot of times those people are busy and you can't get there. So building a network and just talking to the right people that are going to help you to ultimately get to those folks is where I would always tell people to start. Establishing yourself as someone that people want to interact with and talk to, and see you as some level of an expert or someone having a unique insight into the area of business you're going into is critical. So establishing yourself, reaching out and starting to network, building that network from scratch, which isn't easy. Again, it's dirty work. It's roll up the sleeves. But I think you're going to find, if you do that and you just start talking to people without trying to sell to people, a lot of those people are going to help to guide you in the right direction. It's a tough ramp up when you've got no network and you're starting from scratch. And so that's why I would tell people, do multiple things. Do that do that AI outreach, do some email stuff, but constantly build yourself up and your personal network as quickly and as effectively as possible to support what it is you're trying to do.
Yeah, I agree. It's just that what you're talking about takes time, and if you're
Yep.
just starting out, typically you don't have that much time because your boss is watching you, or if
Yep.
you're a founder yourself, you got to make money. I still believe that cold calling, picking up the phone and dialing it, using email blast, using
Yep.
LinkedIn outreach, those are all ways that you should be reaching out, because they're more immediate. Now, I'm with personally, I'd rather live in my car than ever have to cold call again. And I do it once a month just to make sure that what I'm teaching people is still working.
Yeah.
Well, I hate doing it. I love teaching it. I just hate doing it, which is why I became very good at once I formed my business. And I built my business on cold calling, by the way. I had nothing else
Yeah.
to do. I worked for another training company, decided to open up my own, had nothing to do because I wasn't going to steal their customers except sit on the phone all day. 20 years ago, email blasts weren't as big and LinkedIn was
Yep.
just starting out. So I didn't have anything else. But I became very good at networking, giving speeches, getting
Yep.
referrals, and using LinkedIn, which is where
Spot on.
99% of my business comes from today, so that I don't have to cold call. But I still say that cold calling, email blasting, LinkedIn outreach,
Yep.
they're more immediate. So you should be doing all that stuff while you're
Yep.
building that network so that you don't have to do all that stuff later on.
Absolutely. And I think you brought up a key point, which is too, building up credibility by finding people or finding groups or business associations or people that are looking for what it is you provide so that you can, not that you're, it's a jump start, but it's much better to talk to 20 or 30 people than it is to talk to one person at a time. So finding ways to not only cold call, but virtually cold call and expand the process. I couldn't agree with you more. I think it's all of the above, but always constantly, just like you did, having a vision for how you're not going to have to make 25 phone calls a day or whatever the metric is, how you're going to get beyond that.
Yeah. And yes, I'm with you 1,000,000%. I'd rather give a speech to 40 people than call one because I've got 40 chances of getting somebody
Yes.
interested. And the National Speakers Association says that out of every speech that you give, 1 out of 10 people in your audience will be interested in what you've got. They may not end up doing business with you, but at least
Yep.
there's interest, which is why put a room full of people together. I'm coming to talk at any time. I found something. One of the things I do when I'm putting together these interviews is I go to people's LinkedIn feeds, and I saw something on there that I found was fascinating. About a week ago, you tried to fix your printer. Now, when I read that, I was like, guy after my own heart. I always try to
Yep.
fix stuff first, and I often I'm the kind of guy who I'm good at figuring out what makes things work, but I will get into it and forget that I'm actually I'm spending time instead of investing it. What did trying to
Yep.
fix your own printer teach you?
Yeah, it's it's funny. It's kind of what we just talked about it to some effect. It's like, first of all, if you rewind and you go back to one of the questions you asked me about 92% of the companies not having a sales process, right? It's like we get into these situations, and I don't know if it's ego, if it's what it is, but it's like you think, I know what I'm talking about. I can figure it out. And it's funny in that post. I'm almost embarrassed to say this, but I worked for Lexmark, a printer company, for about 7 or 8 years. And so when the printer doesn't work, I think, I know what I'm doing. And so I spent an inordinate amount of time doing exactly what I advise small and medium companies not to do. It's like, if you got a problem and you really don't know how to fix it, get an expert. Talk to someone, get the right person and bring them in, because it's exactly what you said. And I like to think I'm pretty good with my hands and I can build things and figure things out. And sure, maybe if I spent 6 or 8 hours, I could have finally gotten there. But literally, when you got the expert on the phone, or it was in a chat, and the first 2 sentences that he typed to me identified the problem and fixed it, it was like, okay, that cost me 2 or 3 hours that I shouldn't have. So, lean on the experts. That's what we're all here for. And, the thing that I always think that people are concerned with, especially when they start to delve into sales expertise, is I think they're afraid that we're all going to be that rabid salesperson that scares them. And, that's why I always like to talk to people and say, listen, I'm not sure if I can help you, but let's have a conversation. If it works, great. If it doesn't work, that's fine. It's just, but I think I might be able to at least help to guide you in the right direction.
Yeah.
So,
When I read it, I recognized it. I'm like, yep, I'm that guy too. I can fix this. I'm a smart guy. I can figure it out. And usually
yeah,
after an hour or two, I'll go, okay, maybe I ought to call Lenny, my IT guy. And,
yeah,
and typically he laughs. He goes, "Good. How much time did you just spend trying to do this yourself?" I'm like,
Yep.
2, 3 hours. He goes, "Yeah, okay." And he takes over my
Yep.
computer, and as I watch, he's moving stuff around. And 3 minutes later, everything's fixed. And I actually co-authored a book called "Leverage Your Laziness," which is not about being lazy, but it's about
Yep.
that you're better off and you're going to be happier and make more money if you focus
Yep.
on the things that you're good at and enjoy doing, and find somebody else to do all the other stuff that you suck at or don't enjoy
Yeah.
doing. And even though I enjoy figuring stuff out, it's not a smart investment in my time to invest 2 hours trying to fix a computer problem when I could pay somebody some money and they'd fix it in 10 minutes, because now I'm productive for another hour and 50 minutes that I wouldn't be
Yeah.
otherwise.
Well,
And
it also goes hand in hand with, you have a lot of conversations with people, and we've talked about it. It's like building a sales infrastructure, right? Uh, you can go, if you're a small company, you can go out and you can go through the process of hiring someone who has experience doing it. So you go through the recruiting process, the hiring process, you bring them on board, you go through everything. And maybe these people have built an infrastructure once or twice, maybe. But if you look at it on average, the average company that decides to build infrastructure and they do it internally, it's going to take them a year and a half, 2 years to get through the process. You talk to someone like me who's done it multiple times in large companies, and I have a pretty tight process. I could start tomorrow and have an infrastructure built in 4 months, 5 months. And you're once you have that in place, sometimes you don't need that person you've hired, and now you're kind of stuck with someone in the roles. So it's exactly what we're talking about. I mean, we do it in so many different facets of our life. We don't even think about it. If your car's not working, you're not crawling under the car, rolling up your sleeves, trying to figure it out. You take it to your mechanic and they fix it. It's the same thing, whether it's a printer or whether it's structure or whatever. Get the right people, and it's so much, it's so much cheaper, so much easier, so much less stress around it.
Yeah, well, typically when the car's not working, first I open the hood and I stare at it for a while and go, "Wait a minute, I don't know anything that's in here other than changing the oil,
Yeah.
and I got to take it to a guy to do
Yeah.
that. Maybe I should just drive to the mechanic." So, what are some of the most common signs that a business needs to rethink its sales infrastructure?
Yeah, I think it's a number of the things that we just talked about. Generally, when you have conversations, with small and medium business owners, and they're struggling, their sales have fallen off, and the activity that they're doing, it isn't getting them where they need to be. Growth has stopped. There's not enough hours in the day. The other one I run into a lot, and I'm sure you can relate to this, is you talk to companies and they say, "Oh, I've hired one or two salespeople and it just didn't work out." And I literally had a conversation recently with a company, and the guy said, "I've hired 5 salespeople in the last year. None of them worked out." And my line to him was, it wasn't the salespeople that didn't work out. It was, they didn't know what they were supposed to be doing. And when you bring a salesperson into a company, a salesperson is generally very good at executing and very good at enhancing. So if you've got a process and you want them to carry it out and you want them to put their personal touches on it, good salespeople are excellent at that. If you're not telling them what your expectations are, and you don't have kind of a roadmap, and you don't have all the tools created, that's not in the wheelhouse of most salespeople. So it's really about the fact that if you're stalled and you can't figure it out, or you're trying by hiring salespeople and not having success, and you're really just not getting the traction, or you're not, the activity isn't leading to what you need, chances are good that you haven't built that scalable process, and a lot of the other things that go with it too. If you identified the ideal customer, does your value prop stand out, all of those things are part of the process. But that's usually what you find is there really isn't a document or a process, or a documented process that they're following, and so they don't really know what's working and what's not.
So, when you first start working with a new client, what's the first thing that you evaluate when you're assessing a company's sales performance?
It's funny, and I think most of us in corporate America, when you've spent any time there, you're very trained on what I like to tell. You can call it the pipeline or the forecast or whatever it is, but it's like I want to understand what you have in the pipeline. I want to understand what's real, what's not real. I want to understand what your recurring revenue is, and I want to understand what your activities are to continue to feed that pipeline. And I think it's a real common sense approach that highlights a lot of things very quickly. If you're talking to a company and they do, $5 million in sales, and I'm going to use your example that you gave, and you're talking to them in May or June, and you're saying, where are your sales this year? What do you have in the pipeline? Where are you going to finish your year? If they can't really answer that question and show you that they have a clear, concise plan to get to $5 million or 5.5 if you want to grow by 10% or whatever your goal is, then there's a very good chance that they don't have the fundamental pieces in place to do that. And, too many times when you talk to, small and medium businesses, the success story is I got lucky. Last year, I didn't think I was going to make my number. And then one big order came in, one big customer connected. And, luck isn't sustainable. I mean, to be honest with you, as I tell people, I'd rather be lucky than good. But luck isn't a business plan. It's not going to get you there. So I always start with that because I think that's, at the end of the day, the lifeblood of any company is going to be revenue. Are you driving and generating sales and revenue that you need for the company? And if you're at a point in time and you can't comfortably demonstrate a plan that's going to show the growth that you need or the stability you need, then chances are very good there's a lot of missing components to the sales process.
Yeah, and I'm constantly stunned by how many companies I go into, and they don't have what I consider to be the most basic things to get them going. Like they don't have a CRM, they don't have a pipeline management system, they have no clue what their sales. I mean, it's astounding the things that you and I take for granted that they're just not there, and then they're wondering why they're not successful. One of the things that's crucial is the ability to differentiate, especially in a crowded market. And some people call it a unique selling proposition or unique value proposition. How do you help companies define their unique value proposition?
Yeah, I think that's it's so critical and it's so important because, as I like to tell people, I mean, that's kind of the definition of your DNA, right? It's like who you are and what you are, and you have to know how and why you're communicating it. Too many times you get into these discussions with companies, and their value prop is, if you go into their competitive space, and the value prop is the same for every company that's doing it. You go into, I'm talking to a home improvement company the other day. Um, you know, you're licensed, you're reliable, you're all these things. It's like, okay, every person within your space is communicating the same value prop. So you're not differentiating. And so I always challenge people to go back and, it's like that, everybody has a different percentage that they use, 95% of what you do is the same, right? What's your 5%? What's your point of difference? How do you stand out from others? And how do you communicate that so that your customers understand that that's important to them? And, a lot of times, it's, when you're talking to a business, if it's built on a real strong foundation, there's a lot of things that you've done or that you personally have brought to the table that need to be highlighted so that people can understand they're not just talking to another company that does X. And I think that's kind of one of the initial things that you always get into, when you're talking to customers is, that definition of the ideal customer and the definition of the value prop, because I think they're afraid that if their value prop isn't broad, right, if it doesn't say everything, that they aren't going to appeal to everybody. And the reality that we all know is if it's too broad, it says nothing, right? It's just like your ideal customer profile. If your ideal customer profile is anybody who will do business with me, um, your targeting isn't going to be successful. So I think it's always kind of challenging that, and maybe just getting people to think about it, because I think people really understand what's different about them, and I think sometimes they're afraid to kind of lean in on that, you know.
Yeah, I'm with you 1,000,000%. Yeah, the truth is, any company in the world that has salespeople is a good prospect for you and me, but that's too broad. You need to niche it down.
Yeah.
We talked a little bit about sales process before, and when you go into a company and you help them implement a sales process, is it the same sales process for every company, or do you customize it by industry or even particular companies?
Yeah, boy, I wish one size fits all for anything, right? It doesn't. I mean, I think that the fundamental components of a sales process are all similar in nature. But I don't think, I think even if you're talking to two companies that are in the same industry doing the same thing, I think there's uniqueness to every sales process. And what I always like to try to explain to people, because I think a lot of people don't understand, you know, the sales process, the value of it and what it does. And, a lot of people view a sales process as restrictive in nature, right? It's like, oh, you're putting handcuffs on me or whatever. As I like to explain to people is, if you eliminate the areas that people generally have to think about, if you take the guessing game out of that, and you define that up front, and you put the guardrails and the approach and everything into place for people as they go through the process. The fun part of it is then customizing it for that business and for the salesperson themselves. And I think that the best sales process that I've built recently is the one where, as we were going through the sales process, we redefined the ideal customer. It actually made the company rethink its strategy. And so once we did that, we came up with this very unique sales process. And then once we pushed it out to the people who were selling, they got very engaged in it, and they started to create their own individual process based upon what we defined. And that's it's whether it's assigning quotas or building a process or doing anything, if you can't get people to engage and buy into what you're doing, it's papers in a book, right? And so I think the more you can customize, the more you can engage the people in the company in feeling that they have ownership in it. It then becomes, and I hate to use the term, but it's a living, breathing document that they feel is a part of their company, and they're kind of proud of it, and they want to use it, and they want to build upon it. And so that's the personalization process of it. It's not to say that every sales process isn't going to have, how are you going to handle objections? What are the key objections you handle? How do you want to approach them? How do you work through that discussion? Those things are going to be there, but getting people to kind of build those from personal experience and from what they're trying to communicate to their customers, I think that's the fun part of what I like to do.
So, why do so many SMBs struggle with implementing a sales process at all?
Yeah, because exactly where we started that discussion, and I think you kind of even touched on it in one of your examples. I think people don't understand, and I think they don't understand what it is. I think they don't understand how it can help them, and they don't understand how it literally makes the life easier after you have it in place. I think people view it as being, kind of restricting, their freedom. And, a lot of people in these small companies, their identity is they're the salesperson, right? And there's not a process. It's a personality. It's how they do things. And, if you get them to understand what you try to do with a sales process, process is to bottle up that magic and make it so that as you start to grow and scale, if I'm bringing in, if I go from a founder-led sales team where that founder is doing, if not all, the majority of the sales, the goal should be to build a sales process so that when I have 3 or 4 or 5 people that are now selling your business for you, they're conveying the essence of what you are and how you got there. And that's kind of the key to the sales process is creating something that consistently conveys the messages to your customers and helps you so that you can bring people into that organization who are going to be able to do that in a way that doesn't detract from what you've built in the past, but helps you to build upon it. Because once they get engaged and start doing it, they're going to find better, different, more unique ways to bring that to the customers, and that's how you scale and build. That's kind of the key in my mind.
Gotcha. So for those who are watching us live, you already know this, but for those who are going to be watching on the replay, we had a technical difficulty this morning. We started the interview and about 5 minutes in, something went wacky with StreamYard and I had to start from scratch. So Mike, I should have asked you this before we restarted. You were supposed to go to 11 o'clock. Do you have time to go a little bit over so we give the people a full hour, or do you need to start at 11 o'clock?
Absolutely.
Okay,
no
so
hard
we'll go
stop.
about another 20 minutes and give the people a full hour.
Yeah.
I wanted to ask you about this because I run into it regularly. Sometimes you take over a team, you walk in to be the fractional sales leader, and you've got some people who are doing well, but some people who are underperforming. What advice do you have for reps who are currently struggling on how they can turn things around?
Yeah, so it's really interesting, and we talk about past experience and things that you went through. I was with Newell Brands when the merger went through with Jarden. So they brought together 16 companies. It was like $16 billion, and there was restructure like I had never seen in my entire career. And we were building and rebuilding sales teams on a 6-month basis, based upon business channel, whatever. And one of the fundamental things that you have to become good at is answering and evaluating that point that you just brought up, right? Because at the end of the day, I have a firm belief, and maybe there's some percentage that don't fall into this, but I don't believe that there's a salesperson who wakes up in the morning and says, I don't want to do a good job. I don't want to work. I don't want to do these things. I think everybody wants to do a good job. And so, basically this comes down to 2 fundamental evaluations. Is it the right person in the right seat? And do they have the right tools to be successful? Or as I like to say to people, have you set them up to be successful? Can they do their job? And do they have all the, the right things so that they can kind of operate on their own? And, so the evaluation process, a lot of times salespeople are not successful because of that second point, because they haven't been set up for success. They don't really have clear expectations about what their job is. They don't know where their decision-making, authority is. They don't know, when they can negotiate, when they can't negotiate. And, just sometimes, quite frankly, you've got people that are doing something because they've done it before and they believe it's the right thing. And then they've got a manager that doesn't agree with that, but hasn't communicated it to them yet. So, so I think it's two different things. One is, you have to figure out, does the person have the skill set and the ability to do what we're talking about? That's the first part you evaluate. The second part is, has the company set them up with with everything that they need on a daily basis? I always kind of preach to people, and this is my opinion, and it's open for, debate or whatever, but I'd rather have a good athlete in a position. I'd rather have someone who wants to do the job, who has a good attitude about it, and someone who wants to learn. That for me appeals to me a lot more than someone that thinks they already know, how to do it, or they've done it before and they've been there. So, if the person isn't successful and you can deem them to being, trainable, teachable, whatever, then I think you've got to give them the best shot at being successful. And then I think what you've got to dig into is, do they have the right process, the right tools, the right guidelines, the things that they need to be successful? And I think once you explore that and go through the process, certainly there's going to be people that fall into the camp that it's just not the right fit. But I think making sure everybody's given the best possible chance to be successful is where I always start with, in the process.
Yeah. I suggest that, if you're a salesperson in a slump, that it's possible that it's just nature. You just happen to meet a bunch of prospects in a row that just weren't right for whatever reason. Maybe it's not your fault, but what I always suggest is don't just sit there. Go do something.
No.
Because you're probably not going to figure it out on your own. This is the time to go to somebody like yourself, or go to a coach, or go to your manager, or read a book, or go to a seminar. Do something. But we all know the definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over and expecting a different result. So when you're in a slump, it's either go back to the basics. Because that's what I often find, that when people aren't doing well, they stop doing the things that made them successful in the first place. They stop making the calls or sending the emails, or doing the prospecting, or they change their sales process. They skip steps. They got cocky. So it's often just time to go back to the fundamentals.
Well, whoops.
Go ahead.
I was going to say, I would also, you're so spot on. I think, one of the best salespeople I had in recent history was someone who was self-aware enough to come to me and say, listen, I don't feel like it's working at X customer. How can you and I partner to make this happen? Because at the end of the day, I would tell a salesperson, if you're feeling that, if you're feeling you're in a slump, if you're feeling you're not, doing what you should be doing, your manager, the people around you, are probably also feeling that way. And the person who should have your best interest in place is your manager. So going to that manager and leaning in and basically saying, listen, you're my manager, help me. What can we be doing to do this? It shows that you care, and it shows that you're still open to learning something new. And I think that's the most important thing. I think you commented about, you and I as people, I learn something new every day. I have conversations with people where I go, wow, that's great. That's I think the key to to longevity is be self-aware and know that if someone tells you something, you can learn from them.
Yeah, Mimi's right. She says, don't just sit there. She's absolutely right. And I think part of the challenge is that quite often salespeople think that if I go to my manager or my boss, whoever we're talking about here, if I go to them and say, hey, I'm struggling, I'm having a hard time, what do I do? That makes the salesperson look weak, or like they don't know what they're talking about. And I believe you and I are on exactly the same page. If a salesperson comes to me and says, Jeff, it just ain't working. What do I need to do? I'm thrilled. I'm not happy that they're not doing well, but unless they've come to me, I'm managing, multiple companies, multiple salespeople at the multiple companies. I'm doing training. I've got a million different things. I may not be as aware as they are of their situation. And when a salesperson comes to me and says, I need your help, I'm thrilled.
Yeah.
Because that's your job and my job. How do we help salespeople be successful? So I want to have that conversation. And to me, it does not make them look bad. It actually makes them look good.
No, and I also think the flip side of that is one of my core beliefs, when I was managing large sales teams, is that the salesperson should be the hero to the customer. The escalation is if you need someone to be a bad guy, escalate, because the last thing you want to do is if that person has to deal with the customer 24/7 and they have to deliver bad news, and the bad news is not something that they're it's a company issue, it's something that happened. Don't be afraid to engage your manager and let them take the bullet for you, because that's what they're there for. The goal should be, and it's kind of the, I never take credit for someone else's success. It's like if I've got someone that's calling on a big customer, I don't ever want them to be viewed as not doing what's in the best interest for that customer. So be comfortable enough with your manager to admit when you have an issue, a challenge, a problem, and use that manager. And quite frankly, if that manager can't help you or doesn't want to, then it's not you that's failing the process, you know?
Yeah. So many companies struggle with hiring salespeople. You brought it up
Yep.
before. What's the biggest mistake you see in how companies are hiring sales talent?
Yeah, that's the $1 million question, right?
Yeah.
And I think the problem that I see most frequently is going through the exercise of defining what that person is going to do up front and really understanding there's a big difference between different kinds of activity in the sales process. You know, we talk about this frequently in the sales world, right? Being someone who's a really good customer manager. If you've got a business and you maintain customers, you do work with them on an ongoing basis, that's a very different skill set than someone who's going out and doing business development work, or someone who's flipping through and doing a lot of different things and different customers. And I think too many times companies get enamored with the resume versus the fit for what you're trying to do. And so making sure that you've defined what this role looks like. I even go through an exercise with companies when I do it that even drills down before you're going out and hiring to understand top line perspective. What does the 30, 60, 90-day plan look like for that salesperson when they onboard? What are the things that they're going to go through and what are they going to learn? Because I think if you do that exercise up front and you really get into a deep conversation with someone you're thinking about hiring, you're really going to understand if they're going to be able to do the job and fit with the process. And so I mean, I know that's probably two answers to the question, but I think they're kind of really married together, which is defining that job is critical and knowing what the expectation is. And the flip side of that is interviewing for that. I think one of the things that we see a lot of times in small to medium businesses is I'm the founder, I'm one of the partners, whatever. I've been doing sales. I want to hire someone like me to do sales, right? And you go out and do that. And, the concept that we've talked about multiple times, which is, good salespeople, most of them are good at building your strategy and your approach and how to build your business. They're good at executing, and thinking that someone is going to have the same passion and approach that you took when you started the business, it's probably a disconnect. And so it's not to say that having someone who's a good personality fit for you, someone you can work with, someone you like, someone you feel like you can challenge, I think those are all great qualities. But applying it to what they're going to be doing is probably even more important.
Yeah, I find that quite often companies simply are not asking the right questions
No.
on an interview. And I say that you can't interview salespeople the way you interview anybody else. Everybody else is different. Salespeople are different we're different animals. We just are. Personally, when I'm interviewing salespeople, and as a fractional sales leader like you are, I'm often hiring a team from scratch or adding on to an existing team. I don't care where you see yourself in 5 years. I don't care what your spirit animal is. I don't care if you can tell me how many, manhole covers there are in San Francisco.
If you were a tree, what tree would you be?
Yeah,
Yep.
I don't care about that stuff. And I understand that Google wants to ask those questions of software engineers, but for salespeople, I only care about one thing. How are you going to do the job? Let's say I hire you, Mike, and you start tomorrow. Well, tomorrow's Saturday, but you start Monday, and I hand you a phone and a computer, and I say, "Go get them, pal." What are you going to do?
Absolutely.
And that's a real question I ask people on an interview. And if they say, "Well, I don't know, I thought you were going to kind of tell me what to do," that's not my salesperson. But if they say anything like, "Well, I guess the first thing I would do is I ask you for our current customer list, and I'd like to call all of them and interview some of them and see what they like about us. And I want to try to develop an ideal client profile. Then I'm going to start reaching out to people on LinkedIn." I don't much care what they say as long as they give me something intelligent, because that shows me how they're going to do the job. Because salespeople, that's the end game. Look, everybody's game is they've got to do their job. But in sales, if we don't do our job, nobody eats. The
Yeah.
founder doesn't get to eat. The people
Yeah.
manufacturing our product or delivering our service don't eat. We got to produce every single day. So that's mainly what I'm interested in. And I'm also interested in what drives them,
Yeah.
because
Yes.
I can't teach you how to be motivated. As a sales trainer, I can teach anybody how to sell. I can't make everybody a superstar, but I can teach anybody how to sell. But I can't teach you how to be honest. I can't teach you
No.
how to be friendly. I can't teach you how to be assertive. I can't teach you how to be a winner. You either
No.
have those qualities or you don't. If you've got those, then guys like you and me can help you succeed.
Yeah.
Yes?
Yeah, I think you're spot on. I think the other piece of it is too, that I always tell people is I think if you're hiring a salesperson, because a salesperson, the other thing that I always find extremely important is they have to be able to work with and communicate with all aspects of the company, right? If there's a customer problem, they've got to be able to, and I'm going to exaggerate for the purpose of this, they got to be able to pick up the phone and call someone in the warehouse and figure out what's going on with the order. If there's something wrong with the product or a package, they got to be able to pick up the phone. So I always believe that as you go through this process, that you should have people within your company talking to the salesperson and the salesperson talking to them, so that they both sides can figure out if this is a good fit. Because I think whenever someone is being hidden from other people within the company, that because I would always say when I'm interviewing, or when I was interviewing, I'd say, can I talk to a couple of people that do what you want me to do? Right. And if a sales manager is like, whoa, 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 wait a minute, then maybe I'm not the right fit, and that's fine. But if you're not willing to let me talk to the people and kind of understand what a day in the life is like, maybe you really haven't thought it out that well. And so I think
Or what are you hiding?
yeah, I think that relationships piece that you're talking about is critical. I mean, one of the things I loved about when I was at Newell Brands is, they used to have this terminology, which is, while we're restructuring, you have to continue to perform. So it's not like you take a break while you're figuring things out. And the example that you gave is part of the discussion that we used to have with every salesperson, which is, okay, there's a very good chance on Monday you're going to be in a different role. What are the actions you're going to take on Monday to make sure your business doesn't slip? And I think that's a great way to talk to people. So,
Mike, one of the things I love doing when I'm researching for these interviews is I love taking personal experiences that people have and asking about those. And you recently vacationed in Hawaii, and you I don't know if you hiked or drove up to the top of Haleakala Crater, which I also did, and then rode a bicycle down. What did watching the sunrise over the Haleakala Crater teach you?
it's so funny because I posted that, and it taught me two things. The first thing that I'm going to say might not be favorable, but my wife and I completely think about things completely differently, right? Because
Awesome.
you know that when someone tells you you're going to do that. So we did it with a tour. And so my wife said to me, okay, on day 2 of our vacation, we're going to be picked up at the hotel a little bit before 2 a.m. We're going to ride on a bus for about 2.5 hours, and we're going to go up there, and we didn't know the details, but we're going to stand outside for a while and watch the sunrise. And, as you can imagine, the way my brain works is it was like, there is zero chance I would have ever done this, thought of this, or even given it a look on my own. And so we did it. And I went through the process, and I must say a little bit at the beginning, I was probably a little bit grumpy, thinking about what am I doing, and then once you experience it, and I don't think you can compare it to anything. I just, after watching it and going through the process, you see it, you feel it, you get so kind of pulled into it when it's happening. It's nothing. It's like nothing you've ever experienced. And so the things I take away from that, because I always do try to reflect on things, and especially when you learn a lesson, right? I mean, one is patience, right? I mean, patience is something that I think most of us probably don't deal with well in a big basis. But the other thing is, thinking outside of the box, challenging yourself, doing something that maybe feels uncomfortable or doesn't feel right. Because I can tell you, everybody I've talked to afterwards, they say, okay, after you did it, would you do it again? And I say, 100%. As much as when someone explains it to you and you go through whoa, wait a minute, because it was below 40 degrees also that morning when you get up there. So you're in Hawaii, dressed for Hawaii, and they throw you this big coat and say, stand here. And you go, what am I doing? But just a tremendous experience that I think kind of challenges many things that I think are kind of my core beliefs, and think outside of the box, challenge yourself, do something different. I love what I took away from that experience.
That's great. I actually had an opposite experience. I was there doing some work for Siemens Corporation. It was a customer appreciation event where they flew me to Hawaii to do some training for their customers. Yep. And I had a day in between events. And I said, I'm going to do this. This sounds great. Unfortunately, we did get to the top and it was a complete cloud cover. So we could not see the sun actually rising, which was very disappointing.
Oh,
but then the bike ride down was a lot of fun. And Mike, we actually are out of time. But before we go, I want to share my screen. Would you please tell people how they can reach you if they're interested in speaking to you or possibly using your services?
Yeah, I think always the most simple way to reach out is my cell phone number is here. I have my children are in that generation where calls, text, whatever. I'm always open to a discussion or my email address, madams@salesacceleration.com. I like to always tell everybody I am wide open to having a discussion. I'm not going to try to sell you anything or try to do as I just talked about. I'm against doing. I'm not going to try to close or present. Give me a call. I'll tell you if there's something I can do to help or not. And hopefully, if I can't do something, I can at least introduce you to someone that can.
And Mike, the people who were watching us live or watching on replay, they would see your phone number, but this will get converted to a podcast and the people listening to that won't know it. So would you like to give out your phone number?
Absolutely. 508-596-6292.
Perfect. Mike Adams, thank you for sharing your brilliance so generously and for putting up with the technical difficulties, which I think I've been doing these for 5 years, almost every week. And this is the first time I've had something like that, but thank you for sticking with it and getting back on. And I'll end as I always do. Gang, please remember that sales is a game of making things happen. Get out there and make sales happen. Have a great day, everybody, and a great weekend. Thanks again, Mike.
Thanks, Jeff. Bye.